In the Arizona Territory, where the land stretched wide and unforgiving, and the sun burned truths into men, whether they wanted them or not, there were some debts that could not be paid in gold. William Hartman had learned that lesson the hard way. Years before the railroads cut the desert into neat lines, and before his name carried weight in town ledgers and land deeds, William had been younger, harder, and far more certain of his right to claim what lay before him. He rode with a survey party through Apache country, men hired to mark borders on land that had never asked to be measured. What happened next was never written down, but William remembered it clearly enough. There had been shouting, fear, a gunshot fired too fast by a man whose hands shook. When it was over, smoke hung low over the rocks, and William lay bleeding from a deep gash in his thigh, abandoned when the rest of the party fled. He would have died there slowly, painfully, if not for a boy, who appeared from between the juniper trees like a spirit, drawn by the smell of blood. The boy could not have been more than 10 years old. He did not carry a weapon. He did not speak. He only knelt, tore a strip from his own shirt, and pressed it hard against the wound. He shared his water, helped William to his feet, and led him mile after mile through rough country until the outline of a trading post rose on the horizon. The boy never asked for thanks. When William tried to speak, the boy was already gone. That boy's name was Caleb. William searched for him for weeks after his recovery. When he finally found the child again alone, thin and grieving the loss of his people, William did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He brought the boy home. Not as a servant, not as a curiosity, as a son. Caleb Hartman grew up under a wide wooden roof, surrounded by money that was never truly his, and eyes that never let him forget it. William educated him, fed him, clothed him, and defended him with a quiet ferocity that only deepened the resentment of his two biological sons. Edward and Thomas Hartman had inherited their father's sharp features, but none of his restraint. Edward, the elder, was calculating and cold, already imagining the estate as his, by right. Thomas, younger and volatile, burned with a loud, unthinking anger. To them, Caleb was an intrusion, an Apache shadow that followed their father everywhere and refused to fade. They could never understand why William tolerated him. They never asked why William trusted him. William did not raise Caleb to be grateful. He raised him to be capable. Caleb learned to read contracts before he learned to write well. He studied ledgers, soil conditions, livestock cycles. When Edward and Thomas chased fast profits, selling off parcels of land, cutting wages, gambling on short-term gains, Caleb watched and remembered. He worked alongside ranch hands, listened more than he spoke, and learned the land as something alive rather than owned. Still, in the Hartman household, he remained undefined, not fully a son, never just a guest, and certainly never invisible, no matter how much he wished he were. Riley knew that feeling well. She was one of many housemaids employed by the Hartman estate. A plain young woman, with brown hair she kept tied back, and a habit of stepping aside before anyone noticed she was there. The other servants rarely spoke to her, unless they needed something done quietly and quickly. The head housekeeper barely remembered her name. That suited Riley fine. It allowed her to see things. She noticed how Caleb moved through the house without drawing attention to himself, how conversations stopped when he entered a room, how he was spoken about, but rarely spoken to. She noticed how he held his temper when Edward sneered or Thomas laughed too loudly at his expense. And she noticed how Mr. Hartman watched him, not with pity, but with expectation. The day the engagement was announced, the house buzzed with excitement. A young woman named Margaret Wells arrived in a fine carriage, silk gloves covering her hands, her smile practiced and precise. She was well connected, wealthy, and beautiful in the way portraits liked best: smooth, distant, flawless. William intended the match to secure the future. Margaret intended to secure her status. At first, she was polite to Caleb, curious even. But curiosity curdled quickly when she learned the truth: not only that Caleb was adopted, but that he was Apache. Her smile tightened. Her eyes cooled. During tea, she leaned closer and said softly but clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "I was under the impression your father's generosity extended to business, not charity cases." Caleb did not respond. Later, when Margaret laughed lightly and remarked that she could never tie her life to someone so far beneath her station, Caleb excused himself without a word. Riley watched him leave, his back straight, his hands clenched just enough to betray the hurt he refused to show. That night, William made his decision. He did not announce it. He did not argue. He simply sat at his desk, called his lawyer, and began dictating his will. William Hartman knew his sons. Edward would dismantle the estate piece by piece. Thomas would burn through what remained. Caleb, quiet, disciplined, patient, would build. And so, when William Hartman died, leaving behind a fortune measured in acres and cattle and influence, the future of the Hartman name did not belong to blood. It belonged to the boy who once knelt in the dirt and chose to save a dying man, and to a young woman who watched from the shadows, unbeen yet destined to change everything. William Hartman did not speak of his decision. That silence, more than anything else, unsettled the house. After Margaret Wells departed in her polished carriage, the estate returned to its usual rhythms. Horses fed at dawn, ledgers balanced at dusk, but something had shifted beneath the surface. William moved with a new gravity, as if time itself had begun pressing against his shoulders. He watched his sons more closely. He listened when they spoke, and when they did not speak, he listened harder still. Edward had always fancied himself a man of vision. He spoke often of expansion, of quick sales and liquid capital. He believed land was meant to be traded, not tended. When William questioned him, Edward smiled thinly and spoke of progress, of how the old ways no longer applied. He made profits, yes, but every gain came with a cost that William could see plain as day. Thomas was less subtle. He drank too much, gambled recklessly, and treated workers like tools meant to be worn down and replaced. He had charm when it suited him, and cruelty when it did not. Where Edward was calculating, Thomas was careless, and both were dangerous in their own way. Caleb said little. William began assigning him small responsibilities, nothing that would raise suspicion. Overseeing a cattle count, reviewing grain storage, sitting in on a meeting with a supplier who had been overcharging the estate for years. Caleb asked questions. He listened. He did not interrupt. When the supplier left, pale and stammering after Caleb quietly pointed out discrepancies in his books, William felt something settle inside him. Not relief. Certainty. Caleb understood that wealth was not something to be spent, but something to be sustained. The servants noticed the change long before the family did. Riley saw Caleb spending more time in the study, bent over ledgers late into the night. She brought him coffee once, careful not to meet his eyes, and saw the ink-stained fingers, the tired concentration. He thanked her softly, as if she were doing him a favor, rather than the other way around. She told herself it meant nothing. Still, she lingered outside the door longer than necessary. The official reading of the will did not happen right away. William insisted everything proceed as normal, though his health declined steadily. He walked the land less, ate little, spoke only when it mattered. On his final evening, Caleb sat beside his bed. "You don't owe me anything," William said, his voice thin but steady. "What I gave you, I gave because I believed in you." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to say he had repaid that debt 100 times over. But William shook his head, already knowing. I raised 3 sons, he continued. Only one of them learned to build. William Hartman died before sunrise. Grief did not strike the household evenly. Edward masked his shock behind control. Thomas raged, throwing objects and shouting into empty rooms. Margaret returned dressed in mourning black, her expression carefully solemn, her eyes searching. When the lawyer finally assembled them in the study, the air grew heavy with expectation. The reading was brief, clear, absolute. Caleb Hartman was named sole heir to the Hartman estate, every acre, every head of cattle, every account. Edward's face drained of color. Thomas laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Margaret inhaled softly, then turned to Caleb with renewed interest, as if seeing him for the first time. The house erupted, accusations flew, insults followed. Edward demanded explanations. Thomas shouted that the will must be forged. Caleb stood still, his hands clasped behind his back, absorbing every word without response. He did not look triumphant. He did not look afraid. He looked tired. Margaret approached him later that afternoon, her voice gentle, her smile practiced. I misjudged you, she said. We all make mistakes. Caleb met her gaze and saw nothing he trusted. He declined her invitation to talk further. That decision sealed his fate. Edward and Thomas retreated together, whispering behind closed doors, their anger curdling into something colder and far more dangerous. They did not dispute the will, not yet. They knew better than to act openly. Instead, they planned. Riley heard them, because they forgot she existed, resisted. She had been sent to clean the storage corridor near the old study, an area rarely used, tucked behind heavy oak doors. She worked quietly, as she always did, scrubbing shelves while voices drifted from the adjoining room. Edward spoke first. It has to look like an accident. Thomas paced. The land road near the ravine. One slip, one loose wheel. He won't survive the fall. And if he does? Edward's voice hardened. Then we make sure he doesn't. Riley's hands went cold. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow, every word carving itself into her memory. They spoke freely of timing, of witnesses, of how grief would cloud judgment long enough for the estate to pass to blood. They never once considered her. By the time she slipped away, her knees were shaking. The next day, Caleb rode out at Edward's request. A discussion about boundary markers, Edward said. Nothing urgent. Riley watched him leave from the window, dread pooling in her chest. She considered telling someone, anyone, but fear held her frozen. A servant's word against the Hartman sons meant dismissal at best. By nightfall, rumors spread. There had been an accident. A fall. The ravine road had collapsed beneath Caleb's horse. The body had not been recovered. Edward and Thomas returned somber, shaken, their story practiced and consistent. The household mourned. Riley did not. She waited until the house slept, then ran. She found him near the ravine's edge, broken but breathing, blood staining the dust beneath him. His leg was twisted at an angle no leg should be. His face was pale, his breath shallow. She did not hesitate. She dragged him inch by inch away from the edge. She tore fabric for bandages. She whispered to him, anchoring him to consciousness with her voice. You're not dying, she told him fiercely. Not today. When Caleb finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was not the desert sky but Riley's face, streaked with dirt and tears, determined beyond reason. And for the first time in his life, he realized he was not as alone as he had always believed. Caleb drifted in and out of darkness for 2 days. Time lost its shape. Pain came in waves, sharp, blinding, then dull and endless. His leg burned and throbbed, every breath scraping through his chest like sandpaper. Somewhere beyond the haze, a voice kept pulling him back. Stay with me. It was not commanding. It did not beg. It simply refused to let him go. When Caleb finally opened his eyes, the ceiling above him was low and uneven, made of rough-hewn boards darkened by age and smoke. The air smelled of wood ash and dried herbs. A small fire crackled in the corner, barely strong enough to warm the room. Riley sat beside him on a wooden stool, her sleeves rolled up, her hands stained with blood and poultice. She froze when she saw his eyes open, then leaned forward as if afraid he might disappear again. "You're alive," she said quietly. Caleb tried to speak. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy. She brought a tin cup to his lips. "Small sips," she warned. The water was warm and tasted faintly of something bitter, but it eased the fire in his throat. "What happened?" he managed. Riley hesitated, then met his gaze. "They thought you were dead," she said. "They want everyone to believe it." The truth settled over him slowly, like dust after a collapse. "They pushed," he said. "Yes." "And you heard it all?" She nodded. Every word. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub brush, whispering across the land as it always had. "They'll come back," Caleb said at last, "if they think there's a chance I lived." "They won't," Riley replied. "Not yet. They were thorough in their planning. They'll let time do the rest." Caleb stared at the ceiling, his jaw tightening. His legs shifted involuntarily, and pain exploded through him. He gasped, his hands gripping the blanket. Riley was on her feet instantly. "Don't move," she said, pressing him back down. "The bone's set, but it won't hold if you push it." He lay still, breathing hard. "So I'm crippled," he said. "Not eastless," she answered without hesitation. "And not dead." That mattered more than she knew. For 3 weeks, Caleb did not leave the cabin. It had once belonged to a trapper who never returned from the mountains, tucked into a fold of land far from the main road. Riley came and went under cover of early mornings and late evenings, bringing food, fresh bandages, and news. Edward and Thomas mourned publicly. They wore black. They spoke of loss. They hosted visitors and accepted condolences with practiced sorrow. The story of Caleb's death spread quickly, too quickly, Riley thought. A man does not vanish without questions, but grief dulled curiosity, and money silenced the rest. The estate began to shift. Edward took charge of the books. Thomas oversaw the cattle. Their confidence grew with each passing day. And with every report Riley brought back, Caleb's resolve hardened. "They're already selling off land," she said one night, setting down a loaf of bread. "Short-term deals. Poor prices." He closed his eyes briefly. They always were impatient. "What will you do?" she asked. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as the woman who had dragged him back from death. "We wait," he said, "and we prepare." The plan was not built on rage. It was built on truth. Caleb wrote letters by firelight, his handwriting careful despite the tremor in his hands. Riley memorized names, dates, details. She recalled every word spoken in that storage corridor, every inflection, every careless boast. They gathered proof slowly. A ledger Edward had altered, a receipt Thomas thought destroyed, a witness who remembered seeing 3 men ride out, and only 2 return. And all the while, the world believed Caleb Hartman was buried beneath a cairn of stones near the ravine. It was safer that way, but safety came at a cost. There were nights when the pain took Caleb so deeply that he bit down on a strip of leathers to keep from crying out. Nights when fever returned, dragging him into dreams of falling, of hands pushing him toward the edge. Riley stayed through all of it. She read to him when his eyes ached. She argued with him when he grew bitter. She reminded him firmly that survival was not a favor he owed to anyone else. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Caleb spoke the question he had been holding back. "Why didn't you leave?" Riley stilled, her back to him as she stirred the pot over the fire. "Leave where?" she asked. "You could have run. Told no one. Saved yourself." She turned then, her expression unreadable. "No one ever sees me," she said simply. "Except you." The words struck deeper than any wound. Caleb understood then that what bound them was not gratitude. It was recognition. When the letter arrived summoning Riley to testify regarding estate matters, they knew the time had come. Edward and Thomas were pushing for the final transfer of assets. The lawyer would rule within days. Caleb tested his weight on the crude wooden crutch Riley had fashioned. His leg held barely. "It'll have to do," he said. Riley adjusted the brace one last time, her hands steady, despite the tremor in her breath. "You don't have to come in with me," he said. She lifted her chin. "Yes, I do." The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold. Inside the lawyer's office, the air buzzed with expectation. Edward stood near the desk, composed and confident. Thomas lounged against the wall, smirking. Riley entered first. Then the door opened again. Caleb stepped through. The room froze. Edward's face went ashen. Thomas staggered back a step, his mouth opening soundlessly. Caleb stood tall despite the crutch, his gaze steady, his voice calm. "I believe," he said, "you were about to give away something that belongs to me." And in that moment, before the accusations, before the reckoning, Riley felt something shift. For the first time, the invisible had become undeniable, and the dead had come home. Silence settled over the lawyer's office like dust after a gunshot. Edward Hartman was the first to move. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood, one hand gripping the backrest, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "This is some kind of trick," he said, forcing a laugh that fooled no one. "My brother is dead." Thomas did not speak. His eyes were fixed on Caleb's leg, on the crude brace, on the way Riley stood just half a step behind him, her hand hovering close enough to catch him if he faltered. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Machiti Hartman," he said carefully, addressing Caleb. "You are alive." "I am," Caleb replied evenly. "And I believe that makes today's proceedings premature." The lawyer glanced between the brothers, then back to Caleb. "If you would be willing to explain." "I will," Caleb said, "but not soon." He turned slightly, and for the first time, all eyes followed his gaze to Riley. She felt the weight of it then, the scrutiny, the disbelief, the unspoken question of why a housemaid was standing beside a man who was supposed to be buried. Riley swallowed. The lawyer adjusted his spectacles. "And you are?" "Riley," she said, "I work at the Hartman estate." Edward scoffed. "She's nobody." Caleb's voice sharpened. "She's the reason I'm standing here." The lawyer raised a hand. "Miss Riley, if you have information relevant to this matter, you are legally obligated to speak truthfully." Riley nodded. Her palms were damp, her heart hammering, but her voice did not shake. "I heard them," she said. Edward stiffened. "Heard what?" "You planning it," Riley continued. "The accident, the ravine road, what you'd say after." Thomas lunged forward. "That's a lie." Riley did not flinch. "You said the wheel would break," she went on, her eyes fixed on Edward now. "You said no one would question it if the body wasn't found right away. And you," she turned to Thomas, "said if he lived, you'd finish it yourself." The room felt smaller with every word. Edward shook his head slowly, as if pitying her. "She's confused. She's always had trouble understanding her place." Riley felt something loosen in her chest. "My place," she repeated quietly, "was in the corridor outside the old study, where you forgot I was cleaning." The lawyer leaned forward. "Miss Riley, can you recall the date of this conversation?" Yes, sir. And the time? Late afternoon, just before supper. Edward's jaw tightened. Caleb reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. This is a copy of a letter I sent to you, sir, he said, handing it to the lawyer. Written 3 days after the accident. It details the injuries I sustained and names Miss Riley as a witness. The lawyer read quickly, then looked up. Why did you not come forward sooner? Because if I had, Caleb said, I would be dead. Thomas laughed harshly. You expect us to believe you hid for weeks like some outlaw? Caleb met his gaze. I expect you to believe what you already know. Silence answered him. The lawyer turned back to Riley. Miss Riley, did you assist Mr. Hartman after the accident? Yes. Did you transport him from the ravine? Yes. Did either of the Hartman brothers return to check whether he was alive? Riley's voice hardened. No. Edward slammed his hand on the desk. Enough. This is absurd. Even if he survived, the estate still belongs to him, the lawyer finished coolly. Unless you have evidence that the will is invalid. Edward opened his mouth, then closed it. The lawyer leaned back, steepling his fingers. On the contrary, I now have reason to delay the transfer and notify the authorities. Thomas swore under his breath. Caleb shifted his weight, pain flaring white-hot through his leg, but he did not show it. I don't want vengeance, he said quietly. I want the truth acknowledged. Edward stared at him, something like panic breaking through his composure. You always were ungrateful. Caleb's expression did not change. You always mistook patience for weakness. The lawyer stood. This hearing is suspended. Effective immediately, all assets remain under the control of Mr. Caleb Hartman until a full investigation is concluded. Thomas turned on Riley then, fury blazing. You think you've won something? Riley met his glare. No, she said. I think I did what was right. Guards were summoned. Edward protested. Thomas resisted. Neither mattered. As they were escorted out, the lawyer turned back to Caleb. You should rest. This will not be the end of it. Caleb nodded. I know. When the room finally emptied, Riley felt her knees give way. Caleb caught her arm, steadying her. You did it, he said softly. She shook her head. We did. Outside, the afternoon sun washed the street in pale gold. People stared as Caleb emerged alive, unmistakable, leaning on a crutch, but standing nonetheless. Riley stayed close, her shoulder beneath his arm. I never meant to be seen, she said quietly as they walked. Caleb stopped. He turned to her, ignoring the ache in his leg, ignoring the eyes on them. You were always seen, he said, just not by those who mattered. Something in her eyes softened, broke, then settled. They did not speak again until they reached the carriage waiting at the curb. As Caleb climbed in, Riley hesitated. Come, he said, holding out his hand. You're not going back there. She took it. Behind them, the Hartman estate loomed on the horizon, no longer a place of shadows and silence, but a future reclaimed. And for the first time in her life, Riley felt certain of where she belonged. The Hartman estate had always been a place of noise boots on wooden floors, cattle lowing at dawn, voices raised in argument and command. When Caleb returned, it was silent. Word traveled faster than any horse. By the time the carriage rolled through the front gates, men had gathered near the corrals. Women paused with baskets in their arms, and hired hands leaned against fence posts, squinting as if they did not quite trust what they were seeing. Caleb Hartman was alive. He stepped down slowly, leaning hard on the crutch. Riley had helped him adjust that morning. Pain flared through his leg, sharp and insistent. But he did not grimace. He had learned something in the weeks he'd been hidden away. Pain announced weakness only if a man let it. Riley stood beside him, her hand steady at his elbow. No one spoke. Then old Ben Carter, who had worked the land since before Edward could ride a horse, removed his hat. "Welcome home," he said. That was all it took. The house came alive again, but differently. The air felt cautious, watchful. Servants moved quietly. Conversations stopped when Caleb entered a room. Not out of disdain this time, but uncertainty. Caleb did not demand loyalty. He earned it. The first thing he did was reopen the books. Edward and Thomas had been careless in their haste. Deals half finished. Land parcels marked for sale at insultingly low prices. Accounts drained to feed habits and egos. Caleb worked from dawn until lamplight failed. Riley beside him, learning quickly, asking questions no one had ever bothered to answer before. She surprised him with her memory, her ability to connect patterns he might have missed. Numbers did not intimidate her. Neither did men who believed they should. Margaret Wells arrived on the third day. She wore pale blue, her hair arranged carefully, her expression gentle. She stood in the doorway of the study, as if waiting for permission to enter a room she once believed would be hers. "I'm glad you survived," she said. Caleb did not rise. "I'm surprised you came." She smiled faintly. "I wanted to see for myself." "There were rumors." "Yes," he said. There were." She stepped closer, her voice lowering. "What happened between us, those were misunderstandings. I was frightened. I didn't know who you were then." Caleb closed the ledger slowly. "You knew exactly who I was," he said. "You just didn't like it." Her smile faltered. "I loved you," she insisted. "No," he replied without heat. "You loved what you thought I could give you." Riley looked up, her hands stilling. Margaret followed his gaze then, noticing Riley properly for the first time. The faint crease of distaste appeared before Margaret could stop it. Caleb noticed. "That will be all," he said. Margaret left without another word. That evening, Caleb gathered the workers in the yard. He did not make promises. He did not raise his voice. He spoke plainly. "The land will not be sold," he said. "Wages will be paid on time. Anyone who wishes to leave may do so with no penalty. Anyone who stays will be treated fairly." There was a murmur of surprise, cautious approval. "And one more thing," he added. "If you have grievances, bring them to me. Not my name, me." When he finished, no one applauded. But no one left. The investigation moved forward swiftly. Edward and Thomas were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Their lawyers argued, delayed, postured, but the evidence was undeniable. Riley's testimony was precise. The ledgers corroborated her account. Witnesses came forward. Once fear lost its hold. The brothers were sentenced before winter. Caleb did not attend. Instead, he stood at the edge of the south pasture, watching a group of men repair a fence that should have been fixed years ago. Riley joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "They'll hate you for this," she said quietly. "They already did," he replied. "This changes nothing." Winter came hard that year. Snow settled on the land like a test of resolve. Caleb's leg ached constantly, stiff in the mornings, unreliable on cold days. Some mornings, he wondered if it would ever feel like it belonged to him again. Riley learned to anticipate the bad days. She adjusted his brace, paced his work, argued with him when he pushed too hard. "You don't have to prove anything," she said one night, as he struggled to climb the stairs. He stopped, breathing heavily. "I do, to myself." She met his eyes. "You already have." The words stayed with him. By spring, the estate was stable, not flourishing yet, but alive. Caleb renegotiated contracts, reclaimed land his brothers had nearly lost. He refused offers that promised quick profit at long-term cost. Slowly, deliberately, the Hartman name regained its weight. Riley took on more responsibility without ceremony. She learned bookkeeping, correspondence. She sat in meetings where men twice her age learned to listen. No one called her a servant anymore. One afternoon, Caleb asked her to walk with him beyond the main house, out to a rise overlooking the land. The grass was just beginning to green, the air sharp with promise. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's dangerous," she replied lightly. He smiled. "I want to do something with this place, something that lasts." He told her his plan not just to rebuild wealth, but to invest it. Schools, shared labor agreements, a system that didn't bleed the land dry or the people with it. "Not charity," he said. "Responsibility." Riley listened, then nodded. "Your father would have approved." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I hope so," he said. He stopped walking then, turning toward her. The sun caught in her hair, softening her features, revealing a strength he had come to rely on, without question. "I can't do this without you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Then don't." The wind moved across the pasture, carrying the scent of earth and growth. Caleb took her hand. It felt like a promise neither of them needed to speak aloud. Behind them, the Hartman estate stood changed, scarred, but standing. And for the first time, it belonged not to blood or pride or greed, but to purpose. The land changed slowly, the way all lasting things do. Caleb learned that lesson early in his stewardship. Nothing worth building came quickly, not trust, not prosperity, not peace. Each acre reclaimed from neglect required patience. Each agreement forged with neighboring ranchers demanded restraint instead of dominance. He listened more than he spoke, weighed consequences instead of chasing applause. And the land responded. By the second year, the soil yielded better than it had in a decade. Cattle grew stronger, debts thinned. The Hartman estate no longer whispered of collapse. It spoke quietly but firmly, of endurance. Riley stood at the center of it all, though she never sought to. She no longer wore the plain servant's dress of her former life. Instead, she chose practical clothes suited for work skirts, sturdy enough for dust, and boots worn thin from long days. She learned to read contracts fluently, to balance ledgers with a steady hand, to correspond with merchants who had once dismissed her outright. They did not dismiss her anymore. Some nights, when the house was quiet and the lamps burned low, Caleb would find her seated at the desk he once shared with his father, papers spread before her, brow furrowed in concentration. "You should rest," he would say. She would glance up and smile. "So should you." But they learned one another's rhythms, the days when his leg burned too fiercely for walking, the days when her patience wore thin under the weight of responsibility. There were arguments, but they were honest ones, born of shared purpose rather than pride. In the spring of the third year, Caleb rode out to the far eastern boundary with a group of workers. He did not ride well anymore, not for long distances, and when he returned, his leg was swollen and his face pale. Riley said nothing at first. She helped him inside, loosened the brace, brought water. Then she sat across from him. "You don't need to punish yourself," she said quietly. He met her gaze. "I need to know my limits." She shook her head. "No, you need to respect them." The truth of it settled between them. That night, Caleb stood with her on the porch as dusk folded itself over the land. The horizon burned gold and red, the colors of endings and beginnings tangled together. "I used to think inheritance was about what a miser leaves behind," he said. "Money, land, a name." "And now?" Riley asked. "Now I think it's about what a man refuses to destroy." He turned to her then, slow and deliberate. "I want you beside me," he said, "not as a favor, not as gratitude, as my wife, as my equal." Riley did not cry. She did not gasp or step back. She only reached for his hand. "Yes," she said. They married that summer. There was no grand ceremony, no silk, no spectacle. The chapel doors stood open to the breeze. Wildflowers gathered from the valley, lining the aisle. The people who came were those who mattered: workers, neighbors, families whose lives were tied to the land in ways that could not be measured on paper. Caleb stood with his crutch behind him, his back straight. Riley walked toward him without lace or jewels, her hair loose, her eyes clear. When they spoke their vows, there was no mention of obedience or possession. "I promise to stand when you cannot," Riley said. "And I promise to listen when I would rather command," Caleb replied. That was enough. The years that followed were not easy, but they were honest. Caleb's leg never healed fully. Some mornings he could walk the property without pause. Others he relied heavily on the cane-polished smooth base. He learned to delegate, to trust others with tasks he once believed only he could do. Riley became a bridge between laborers and management, between past grievances and future plans. She helped establish a small schoolhouse on the northern edge of the land, where children learned letters alongside numbers and history alongside responsibility. Apache and white children sat at the same benches, awkward at first, then accustomed, then unthinking of the difference. They funded medical aid for nearby settlements, invested in water systems that kept drought at bay. They gave without spectacle, without naming rights, without expectation of praise. Some called it foolish, others called it revolutionary. Caleb called it necessary. One evening, many years later, Caleb and Riley stood on the same rise overlooking the estate where he had once spoken of rebuilding. Below them, the land stretched green and steady, dotted with signs of life and labor. Children's laughter carried faintly on the wind. "I used to think my father chose me because I was different," Caleb said. "Because I wasn't like his other sons." Riley leaned into him. "He chose you because you were willing to learn." Caleb nodded, "And because he knew I would never forget where I came from." They stood in silence, the sun dipping low. Far from the house, far from the ledgers and contracts, and endless responsibility. There was peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of having faced the truth and lived with it. The Hartman name endured, not as a symbol of dominance, but of stewardship. And when people spoke of Caleb Hartman in years to come, they did not speak first of his inheritance or his injury or the blood he did not share. They spoke of the man who fell and rose again, of the woman no one saw until she changed everything, and of a legacy built not on possession, but on care. That was the true inheritance, and it was enough.